Hey guys, welcome to our LinkedIn Live. Today we'll be addressing how to combat the diversity gap in engineering. As many of you guys know, the concept of DEI isn't anything new. While big tech companies have put out a diversity report in recent years, the industry as a whole is arguably still struggling to improve its diversity. Many tech companies seem to treat the output of their diversity reports as a formality and rarely take direct action to improve their diversity. This proves to be a detrimental reality for diversity movements within high tech. Research shows that 65% of women and non-white tech workers experience some form of bias in the workplace. Diversity in tech is important because it's crucial in every facet of life. It allows for inclusivity and strengthens the environment as a whole. According to a Gartner study published in 2019, diverse teams are 12% more productive than homogeneous teams. This is because people from various backgrounds, including age, gender, race, ethnicity, and culture, reduce bias by approaching problems from multiple perspectives. Therefore, by not investing in a diverse team, it limits the perspectives of the team and in turn hurts the tech industry's progress as a whole. One of the most significant barriers to entry is a lack of diversity in hiring and also role models for underrepresented groups. As an engineering recruiter, I've had first-hand experience and impact in understanding the diversity gap, and it's my responsibility and the responsibility of the larger tech industry to be a solution and part of the change. You know, the benefits and results of a diverse team speaks for themselves, yet this problem is still so prevalent, especially in engineering. It's important to create these spaces where we can learn from each other and come up with solutions to address and solve this problem. With that being said, I'm delighted to introduce you to two outstanding speakers, and if you have any questions during today's session, please do drop a comment and we'll do our best to find time for them at the end. I'm thrilled to introduce Rahma, Director of Engineering at Deliveroo, and Javed, Founder and CTO at Diverse. Thank you both so much for speaking with me today. Rahma, can you tell us a little more about your career so far in engineering and the role that you currently play in Deliveroo?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I just wanted to say really pleased to be on this panel. And yeah, a little bit about me. Like Thomas mentioned, I lead engineering for the grocery group at Deliveroo. And prior to this, I was leading engineering for the restaurants group at Deliveroo. And both of these groups, I was kind of involved in from like a very early stage. So I had like the pleasure to actually develop and like really shape and bring up these groups to like what they are today. In terms of like, my core sort of mission of like working as an engineering leader for these groups, it's about how we make Deliveroo as a preferred partner for right now it's grocery partners and like focus on driving growth and profitability for our grocery partners. Alongside with this, I'm also an angel investor with Excel, and I'm on a board advisor for a few tech companies. I really started my career actually at Microsoft. Way back then, I was a fresh sort of, college grad from University of Toronto, and I started my career at Microsoft. And then that took me to Wealthfront, which is a fintech startup. And that's where I led the financial services areas on building products in the financial advisory space, such as a 529 college savings plan, as well as a portfolio line of credit. And a few years ago, I actually moved into Deliveroo, into my more sort of current and recent role. So.
Perfect, cool. Thanks so much for sharing that with us, Rahma. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on board. Jared, could you also let us know a little more about your career so far in engineering and sort of your latest venture at Diverse and sort of the inspiration as well behind starting the business?
Absolutely. And again, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to speak about these important topics. It's really exciting to see what Storm 5 has been up to in this space. For myself, I started in engineering way back in high school because this was like the rise of the internet. And it was literally like a weekend job, And so the first things I did were like building a website for the local pet shop. And I think, we're going to be talking about whether engineering is like a welcoming or friendly space. But one of the most beautiful things about it is the democratization of knowledge as you get into this industry. And I think it's a double-edged sword. But I started there and then, college, really started getting to some fun projects and doing some really neat stuff and moved from there to getting into Marcom Media. And then finally, eventually building my own startups. I'm now on my third. The second one was really cool. It was an exit to a company called Sprinkler. So I got the opportunity to be doing work with IBM, with AT&T, with Apple, and my AI was part of those stories, which I think is a really exciting reason to be in this space. But when I got into my own startups, that's when you really start to understand the sort of complexity and the whole universe that you're solving for. And that's where I really get excited about talking about how diversity can change the way the world works.
Perfect. Well, it sounds like, yeah, you've been very busy over the past couple of years, which, is always exciting. But yeah, no, thank you. Thank you both for sharing your story. So yeah, no, let's get straight into it. So as Jared touched on just now, Rahma, would you describe engineering on the whole as an inclusive and welcoming profession? And if not, do you sort of think that sort of ruins the public image that engineering gets because of the lack of diversity?
So, I mean, I think I wanted to say that it's a very broad and a very large industry, and it has a very diverse set of cohorts of this different kind of companies and the culture that exists in every different kind of companies. Like, I think I myself will say, I think, the culture experience at Microsoft is very different to a Bay Area tech startup in an early stage like Wealthfront to, something that's in the UK, such as Deliveroo. I think a lot of this was very different. So it's hard for me to make a very sort of blanket statement. So I'll keep my answers a bit more focused on my own experiences and the tech companies I've been part of. I will say, I think, first of all, the ratios are actually of representation are actually quite telling, right? I mean, I think, the lack of representation that actually exists from a university level, believe it or not, when I was in university, computer engineering women ratio were 10%. Right. And that was just people who got in, right? Not even the graduation ratio, right? Or if you start taking into ratios of entry level into any sort of tech company, or the more telling one is a senior executive position, right? I mean, I think a lot of us would have heard in the news recently about Sheryl Sandberg exiting from Facebook. I personally was quite sad because I was just she was such a strong figure, right? I will say though, I think a lot of the stuff there's a lot of efforts being made to make it more welcoming and to make it more exclusive. But I mean, I think the thing is, a lot of these efforts cannot actually materialize to their full potential unless folks with diverse opinions actually have a seat at the table, right? So if a non-diverse group of people, try their best, try their level best to go we're going to try to be as inclusive, we're going to try to think as inclusive, they can still not get the ultimate results and the output that would have naturally occurred if you had a more diverse, set of people at the table. So I think the thing is while a lot of efforts are being made, while I think my own personal experience has been a lot of people have been very welcome and have been trying to be as inclusive, unless we can get more representation, I don't think we can fully realize the potential of the industry becoming overall welcoming, overall inclusive.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think I definitely agree. I think it's important to make sure that you've got to be in those sort of shoes to be able to sort of have that sort of influence, and I completely agree. Jared, what about you? Do you have a sort of anything that you want to add on top of that as well?
Well, I just want to say, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Rahma. Every company just has different dynamics, different solutions, different sort of approaches to how they're looking at diversity. But I think when we look at, we talk about the gap. When we look at where people are starting, I think it's actually really problematic sort of to think about it as if by the time they get to university, that's when we start addressing the problem. At the end of the day, the real challenge is that we as a culture have really created barriers, particularly for young women, for people of color, where we've created a sort of set of expectations that don't really bring in math, science, STEM fields, so that by the time they get to university, those 10% aren't even a solid 10%. So my bigger take is just, there's so many systems we need to fix and change to get this to where it needs to be.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think sometimes it's definitely more of an institutionalized sort of problem. So yeah, it definitely needs addressing sort of earlier on. Rahma, in terms of, from your sort of opinion and your perspective, what do you think is the most challenging aspect of implementing a DEI program? And then what is your most important piece of advice if you're just getting started with DEI?
So I think personally for me, that I would say is the most challenging part is actually persisting through with the goals of it, right? I think oftentimes even large scale D&I programs that are sponsored at very much of a company level with executive involvement from the start. And a lot of those programs start off with a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of zeal, but they're just a lot of times not persisted through. Because the thing to keep in mind here is that to make any meaningful change, you actually need a pretty decent amount of time to bring about that change. These changes do not happen in weeks. They sometimes do not happen in months. Sometimes they need like, a couple of years in the life cycle of a company to actually really bring about the bigger, larger, substantial changes. Now, let's be honest, like a lot of times companies' priorities tend to shift over such long time horizons, right? And so does a lot of the effort to persist through and execute on the goals, right? I think a lot of times when, push comes to shove and, companies go through like a tumultuous time, especially from a financial perspective. And I would say like, sadly, a lot of tech companies are kind of feeling that right now with what's happening in the market. A lot of times these are the objectives that are oftentimes like, the first ones to be sacrificed, right? Like, we're just like, oh my God, like, we need to get rid of people, or like, we need to like somehow balance things out. We need to think about the growth, we need to think about profitability. Like, we just take all of diversity and whatever we might have done for it, we just throw it out of the window, and we're just like, how can we get the company sort of like, back on track? And I think in terms of like the most sort of important piece of advice that I think would be for anyone trying to get started is actually, please get started, right? I think, a lot of times we have like, if this is a problem that we should have had a solution for, we should have been solving yesterday, right? But it's never too late, right? And don't try to construct the most perfect program, right? Don't try to construct it at the highest level, right? Like, because, oftentimes you'll run into an analysis paralysis, right? It's actually literally important to start with some goal, work towards it, and then revise it, right? Because any goal that you have that's over a span of months, you are going to revise, you're going to learn more about it. You'll be like, this worked, this didn't work, let's change this, let's do that. But just get started, right? Don't wait for the perfect goal to exist.
Yeah, no, of course. I think, you're right. It's definitely a problem that we should have solved yesterday. But just to go back on sort of your point about time, obviously, companies have that sort of intention to sort of, bring on diverse candidates and things like that. But obviously, I think we mentioned this. We had a chat about this off air with Javed about sort of time constraints. How would you sort of combat that within your hiring? So obviously, as you said, close to the time, sometimes those are the first things to go out the window. So how do you, necessarily, what would your advice be to sort of combat that?
Sorry, is that to me or to Jared?
Yeah, that was you, Rahma.
Okay. I mean, I think in terms of, sorry, do you mean in terms of like shortening the time, or
so like in terms of how would you necessarily combat sort of the restriction of time and necessarily changing priorities? How would you go about that?
I mean, I think the thing is there, you actually just need champions, right? I mean, I think, as times change and as things happen, like as long as you actually have champions of those efforts, like, people who deeply feel positive and passionate about it. And, again, the higher level that you have those champions and the higher levels you have those sponsors, the better it is. But like, even at like, the grassroots level, right? Even at an IC level, or like, an initial sort of like like M1 manager level, like I think you can still persist through and still try to like hold on or hang on to it, right? Try to go like, okay, let's maybe pause some of these efforts, or like reduce them, like let's not really completely like throw them out the window and stuff, right? But I think at the end of the day, just like with any idea in a tech company, right, like it doesn't get through over the line until you actually have like a strong champion for it, and until that individual has effectively identified other champions for it because they brought them on. I think the same thing exists with this, right? And actually this goes back to the whole like motivations question, right? Like, are you doing it just to put up a show for like the rest of like the tech world to go like, look, we're so diverse, or do you like genuinely feel that there's a value to it? And I think if your motivations are right in the first place, it really helps you sort of like wear out like the tumultuous times should they to come.
100%. Jared, do you have anything to sort of add to that? I know
I would add, and I absolutely agree about having a champion. But for me, the number one question is accountability. Who is being held responsible for these KPIs? Because one of the things we see a lot of folks do is they bring in, or frankly, sometimes they just find off the street, a CDO, like a person, this is a queer person, this is a person of color, they can probably be our CDO. But that doesn't really mean accountability. What accountability requires is that when you look outside the window, people are looking back in to see what's going on. And so one of the things that we recommend sort of from the start is to say, hey, if you're doing an earnings call, you also need to be doing a DEI call. At the same level that you consider the value of sort of what your quarterly numbers are, you need to place the value of a diverse workforce. So for me, accountability, everything you said, Rahma, but I just want to really emphasize the importance of accountability and the importance of transparency on top of that.
Yeah, actually, honestly, that's so perfect. Because the thing I want to add is I think a lot of times when companies set these goals, like sometimes they shy away from being more public about it. And I think, just being transparent and being more vocal and public about your goals and stuff also helps a lot with the accountability thing that you mentioned, Jared, which I think it's bang on, right? It's like you need motivation, but you also need accountability so that there's some level of like guilt or like, there's some level of like, I don't want to say shame because I think it's a very negative word, but there's some level of like, hey, okay, this wasn't something fluff or like something we made up randomly. We have to persist through with it, just like a financials call. So.
Absolutely. And there's no shame in using the word shame because there have been so many decades of people who are overlooked, people who are underserved, and the people who did it are retired. The people who did it, the boomers who built this economy based on a lack of diversity, will never be held accountable. And that's okay, but we don't have to shy away from saying, yeah, but if you're doing it today, then you do deserve a little bit of shame and you do deserve consequences.
Right, 100%. And sort of, just going on from that, Jared, what are your experiences with diversity at your own company? And how do you continue to promote diversity?
Well, thank you. I mean, it's interesting because we don't even like to use the phrase like promote diversity or have diverse plan, because in a way you should be promoting the success of the company and you should recognize that at a genetic level, your company has to have been diverse from the very beginning in order to be successful, in order to make sort of a splash in a world that looks like them. That's why, and you're going to hear me say this again probably, this idea of having quotas or this idea of tokenizing the concept of diversity, it really changes your perspective to say, hey, I want a company that looks on the inside like it looks on the outside. And if you start with that sort of as your underlying philosophy, everything else starts to fall into place. Suddenly, if you have a marketing team, if you have an engineering team that isn't matching what the world looks like on the outside, then a lot of those KPIs where you want to do what's going to be most beneficial for a diverse audience, when you want to build products that are going to be most efficacious for that audience, you're not going to be able to do it if you have a homogeneous team. So suddenly you're able to broaden your KPI set to encompass that. And now you can be successful without saying, oh, we need to hire 3 people with disabilities. No, we need to build a website that is friendly to every type of disability. And therefore we need a team that's made up of those who can recognize the importance of that and implement the right solutions. If that makes some sense, or from a philosophical level. From a practical level, and I get that we have to get there, from a very practical level, I think it really comes down to having reasonable market KPIs against which you sort of promote very specific accountability for each team member. Everybody is responsible for making sure that the company is diverse and that the company is doing on the inside what they want to produce on the outside.
It's sort of like what Juan was saying earlier with, you can only be accountable for what you have influence over. So that brings me on to sort of my next question for you, Juan, actually, is how can you get the entire company, so obviously at Deliveroo, you've got such a massive influence over the engineering team, but how do you get the entire company, including the sort of leadership team, on board with DEI initiatives?
Yeah, so I mean, I think at this stage, like, whether actually most companies appreciate, I think, the importance of DEI initiatives, right? I think the challenge oftentimes is actually constructing a program that's actually viable and practical to implement. I think, very oftentimes we use a lot of our sort of time and effort discussing the challenge of not having DEI initiatives or the benefits of having them, but we literally, what we do is we just focus on the problem of it. We don't actually discuss the solutions as much, right? And we really need to figure out, like, how can we actually change our, like, bring this change in our respective companies, in our respective organizations, right? I mean, I think, if people around you in a company start seeing some amount of momentum, like even if it started on a very, very small scale, right? Like, so for me, like, the most important thing is like my own organization, right? Like, it used to be restaurants, now it's grocery, right? That's an organization that I have a lot of influence over, right? Like, what Jared would be is his larger organization. And so like, I think, the amount of influence and impact that we have there is a lot more than like me having influence over the entire tech organization. Now I can get there, but I can get there by proxy, right? So if I start bringing in change, and if I start like, seeing folks start seeing momentum and everything, then, I don't think at this point anyone kind of like really questions the importance or the value of DE&I. I think it's about just getting it there. So if you are almost that example of like, people who are bringing about that change and people start seeing momentum, I do feel that they will get on board with it. And then eventually you will get sponsorship from like, the larger leadership team. So again, this is like kind of going back to the principle of like, well, don't just wait around until like your company sets the larger goal, until like, larger org sets the goal. Like, if you are really keen on this and for you at any level, right? Like, it's kind of like this thing, one of the values at Deliveroo is like, you never say it's not my job, right? It's just like, get started with it, right? And then like, eventually, like, whichever level you are, like, get started with it with your managers and then see what may exist and see how you can actually take part in whatever may already exist or propose something. And then again, even if it's at a grassroots level, but then eventually I really feel you will find the champions who will take it forward. And I think, in some like, really fortunate cases, and I mean, I think thankfully at Deliveroo we have it. We do have actually exec sponsorship for DEI, and then you can actively work with them to implement it. But even if not, like, start at your own level, start proposing at small scales, and then like just see others. I genuinely feel others will follow. So
yeah, it's got about it.
Yeah.
Perfect. In terms of sort of the access gap, Jared, how do you feel like the access gap manifests in hiring processes?
Well, I think that the access gap manifests everywhere. One of the things that we like to say is the access gap doesn't exist by itself. There are hundreds of access gaps. One of the big ones we talk about that I think it's really relevant to you is that there's a huge gap in terms of the way that people understand how to be in an interview. Right. So you take just one tiny microcosm of the entire HR lifecycle, just the interview part of it, and you have an access gap. That doesn't even include where we're talking about sort of the initial technical awareness, the ability to sort of maintain, success at a university within a specific type of program. Just the fact that people have different experiences in terms of how they do interviews speaks to the broader challenges of what we're trying to do. Now, for us, again, I know there's these big, huge systems with, everything from K to 12 education, all the way to sort of the kind of online tutorials that are available. All of those things sort of feed that access gap. And I think that our question is always going to be, okay, great. How do we build a bridge between the needs and the expectations of these different communities and the way that we want to staff and build our corporation?
Perfect. Yeah, I think, as you're right, there's a lot of access gaps, and especially in sort of the recruitment world, there's definitely sort of access gap, definitely in terms of interviewing process as well. Rahma, how do you sort of go about building a diverse engineering team, especially with people from sort of non-traditional backgrounds, including these without, let's say, the computer science degrees? And what are some creative ways to proactively source candidates from underrepresented communities?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the thing is, I think of this question as almost like twofold. Like, one is about actually getting folks into the door, and second is about like establishing like support or ensuring that these folks that do get inside, like, they're actually set up for success once they're in, right? So in terms of like, the first bit of it, like of getting folks into the door, I mean, I think that's where you need to actually proactively employ a variety of channels to actually recruit talent. Right, like, in terms of like, the schools that you're hitting, the companies that you're hitting, like, there's a lot of actually, like, now we're a lot more fortunate because there's actually companies who work towards like, getting individuals who come from like, non-traditional sources, like actual placements within the tech companies, right? And I think a lot of tech companies, like, appetite is building up more and more. And I mean, I think, there are a variety of channels, so you don't even have to go, like, I feel like nowadays it's actually like really good because you don't have to go too far, right? Like you don't have to go and source someone who doesn't come from like a non-tech background, because there's literally companies that will like funnel you that talent, right? Even in terms of actually like, how you source, right? Even when you're talking about like, the people who do come from like the traditional set of backgrounds, like, are you actually sourcing an active, like diverse set of candidates? And oftentimes like, that's going to be a lot more hard work and like more of a challenge, because like, when you go on LinkedIn and you're looking at like folks with like, a CS background, yeah, you're going to get like a large set of like, applicable candidates who all fit a pretty non-diverse profile. You're going to have to be very proactive and actively go and seek the diverse profiles, right? And like, try to figure out how you can actually get the input of that funnel to be a bit more balanced, to be less skewed than whatever it is in the industry today. Another part of it, actually, I think when Jared was speaking, it kind of just hit me, is also about like, like not just the initial part of like getting them into like start to doing the interview, but like how inclusive is your interview panels, right? Like, a lot of times we also think about like, oh, will this person be able to like pass the requirements that we have, right? Like, will we assess them? To every company thinks to go like, can we find candidates that we assess to be good enough for this company, whether that's from a behavioral perspective, from a tech perspective, or whatever it is, right? But we also have to think about the other things, like how inclusive are our environments when like the candidate gets the first look, like do they actually want to work here, right? Like if the interview panels is from a very non-diverse set of candidates and you have like, a woman of color, like, interviewing with that candidate, like, do you think she will be very like, excited to work for such a company, right? So like, how do we even think about like, getting them into the door? And then, I mean, I think that the other part of this is like, okay, once they're in, how can we build programs to support, these set of folks, right? And I'm going to use a sort of like, a very typical example. And I think, since I've moved to the UK, it's hit me like a lot more and more. But I mean, I guess like maybe the maternity programs in the UK are a bit longer than like what I've witnessed in the States. And, women go on maternity programs. By the time they come back, because the tech is so fast paced and it's such a like, fast moving environment, by the time they come back, their role that they had left actually has been filled with someone else, right? And so they're coming back to a role that they don't even know about. Like, sometimes it's kind of exciting, sometimes it's not, because the landscape has like completely changed, right? They have this whole other like, responsibility, and then this whole other part of their life that they've just like, started. And so a lot of times you actually will see that there is like, quite a bit of a drop-off rate, for a woman who goes on a maternity coming back to going like, I don't really know if I want to continue with this, right? And so I think, that's just sort of like one specific example, which you can even see like, that's such a typical kind of example. Like that's not even like a very like, oh, that's like, a very unique, diverse case. I think it's a very, very like typical case. Women have been working for a long time, but even there, I'm just like, well, that's not very inclusive, right? Like, why aren't we thinking about like how to support them and how to ensure that once they come back, that they do feel like there's a whole career ahead of them, that they don't have to like literally spend 6 months trying to catch up with everything, or their career has a setback. So I think of it as almost like, kind of like twofold, to proactively start figuring out like how do we set up candidates from underrepresented communities for success overall.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, I want to jump on something, Rahma, you said, which I just really love, is the experience of being hired. What are the faces that they see? What is the language in the post? What is the kind of first person interviewing, the first call you get? I think it's absolutely fascinating to hear a company talk about the importance of diversity, the importance of having, a very sort of diverse crew. And then every person you speak to in the interview process is a white male, or in the engineering process in particular is a male who looks frankly like an engineer. I think that what we do is we sort of have this idea of diversity, but then we don't put the rubber to the road and actually build a hiring process, an onboarding process that actually feels like it needs to. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
It's 100% agree. I think it's very much important to make sure that companies aren't just giving off that message that they're diverse, that they actually have to physically show. I think that's such a good point. And so we've touched on that earlier, Javed. But do you support the concept of enforceable quotas to get more women, ethnic background, LGBTQ+, disabled people into leadership roles?
Sorry, what's the question? You're breaking up a little.
Yes, I know what it is. Do you support the concept of enforceable quotas to get more women, ethnic background, LGBTQ+ disabled people into leadership roles?
The concept of what? I'm so sorry. To get diverse
The
people.
concept of enforceable quotas.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what that means. Enforceable qualities.
And quotas.
Quotas.
Quotas. So sorry.
Yeah,
That's me being a dumb American. Absolutely. Well, I really love the concept. I love talking about quotas because I think it's one of the biggest failings of the diversity movement is the ability to sort of slide into this concept of quotas, like as if we had, just some number that we could reach and all of a sudden we've solved the problems of diversity. Rather, and again, I know I said this before, I think we really need to think about how we look on the inside the same as it looks like on the outside. And so what that means is when we're looking at building a diverse leadership team, all of a sudden that leadership team has to also be reflective of that kind of diversity. And it therefore isn't a quota so much as a match. But that being said, I absolutely support doing whatever it takes to get to that match. And I think one of the things we really need to think about is what our intent is in creating sort of a very specific goal set for these leaders. For example, what is this company as a leadership team lacking? So it's not just, oh, we don't have enough queer people in the engineering department, but the question is, hey, when we sit together as an executive team, when we sit together sort of trying to put a project together from scratch, what representation does this voice have? And if it doesn't have it, we need to fill that gap with some representative leadership. So that's kind of the approach I like to think of it coming from.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting to make sure that it's very much representative of society as a whole. In terms of just a sort of follow-up question, as if society as a whole is sort of like predominantly sort of white males, how do you sort of get around that, especially with that sort of that inside up match the outside?
Exactly. I mean, and this goes back to the gap we were talking about before. How do you fill these roles without either, and I'm going to use this phrase, it's a gross phrase, but a lot of people say, well, I don't want to lower our standards. And I think one of the key things we need to ask ourselves is why aren't we reevaluating our standards? Why isn't it a question of looking at unique and different skill sets rather than saying, hey, the skill set that we have always used doesn't seem to match this different group of people. So I think one of the key things we need to do is find roles that really fit these diverse groups. And I think one of the key things when we look at leadership is experience working with diverse teams, absolutely. But I think also we're looking at new ways to solve problems and experience and actually building unique and different kind of products and different product spaces. One of the things that I like to sort of really over and over again emphasize, and as an engineer, is that engineers are people who solve problems. And if you're solving a problem, then you're going to do it in the way that you've been raised and brought up to solve problems. By introducing a diverse group of people into that solution set, you're going to get more and better solutions. And the same is going to be true for any executive role you're going to fill. The more diverse your roles, the more diverse your solutions.
100%. Goes back to the sort of different perspectives, and then the sort of leads to like more innovation and things like that. So yeah, completely agree. And then sort of following on to sort of our final question today, Rahma, how can companies avoid tokenism? We sort of touched on that earlier, but yeah, how can they avoid tokenism when trying to show that they have a diverse and inclusive workforce?
So I think for that, I would say show growth from within rather than just, hiring that token individual externally. And I think actually that goes for both from candidates, who are representing diverse, whether that's for your exec team, whether that's for your middle management, whether that's for candidates just coming through the door, or even actually programs that you have placed in, right? To do your little token DEI program, please don't just hire a diverse officer whose entire job is to it's literally outsourcing your effective project and giving it to them, and have champions from within, right? Like, have your existing engineering leaders be the sponsors, be the champions, have them take time out of their larger schedules, right? Because that's exactly when you're gonna go like, hey, you know what? These are the people that we value the most in this company. These are the people that, we think that their time is highly prized, right? And for us, because diversity and inclusion is so important for us, a part of their time is going to be focused on, and these are also our best problem solvers, right? Like really senior leaders, like best problem solvers. They're going to help us solve these problems, right? And, across every different level, right? So have it from within. And in terms of, again, for having individuals, right? When you hire externally, you're just saying that we had to kind of fix our exec ratio because of XYZ reason of the optics of the situation. Rather, actually, we had this individual, they were able to actually successfully, go through our larger process, our larger environment, actually thrive in that environment, and then come out as, a more senior individual than whatever they started with, right? This is how our larger culture actually promotes, diverse candidates. Because I've seen a lot of companies, who just hire externally, and you see those candidates act a lot of times because the company hasn't actually solved its own internal problems. Those diverse candidates, I swear, leave after a year or whatever, their sort of cliff is, or those things is. So those things never sustain and never survive. As well as someone who starts from within and is able to grow. But yeah, that's kind of how I would do it. Do it from within the company. Don't just outsource your problems and give it off to someone else to solve it. So
I love that. I love the key metric of success being, are the people from diverse groups who come in leaving happy and better than when they started, right? Because what you're thinking about is your company is also, in a way, an educational institution, right? You're training them, you're showing them what it looks like to work in an environment. And if you're doing your job right, then that means they're going to be successful in the next place or building their own startup. So I think that's really amazing, Rahma. My take on this is very similar. I want to add, though, this concept of tokenization is really important. And it's not just the idea of tokenizing people, oh, this is a token, engineer who looks like this. But I think a lot of times we tokenize time. We tokenize this concept of time. And I want to really think about that. The idea of oh, it's Juneteenth, so this is the one day we're going to think about this. Or it's, Pride Month, or it's, Indigenous Peoples Day. When we tokenize time, we cheapen the way that we look at diversity. And I think that, absolutely thinking about what happens from the inside to the outside, but also thinking about how, rather than sort of tokenizing people and tokenizing time, how does DEI become part of your DNA? How does everything you do naturally come from a place of diverse thought, rather than being sort of triggered by the day on the calendar, or triggered by some quota for the number of people that you have to be working with? For me, I think that the most successful thing a company can do with a DEI program is have an absolutely transparent sort of effect, where everything just starts to work, not because you aren't doing anything, but because you're doing so many small things to help people of color, to help people of different ages, to help people of different ability, to help them succeed. You're doing so many little things that they're happy, they're healthy, and they're successful, and that makes the company better. It doesn't need to be a picnic on Juneteenth, and it doesn't need to be a newsletter every 2 weeks talking about your diversity goals.
100%. I think I agree with both of you. So I think, diversity definitely has to come from within. It shows the intention. And it sort of blends in with Jared's point where, consistency is so key. Everything. You can't just have, one day and then, say that, you're a very diverse and aware company. So completely agree. Other questions from me. I'm just wondering if there's any questions from our audience that have tuned in so far. No? Cool. But yeah, no, thank you so much, Jared and Rahma, for speaking with me today. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Please do reach out if you're looking to grow your engineering team or looking for that next role in engineering. And until next time,